Many experts, including environmentalists, are now suggesting that building more nuclear power plants in this country could, in fact, be beneficial. Joining me now to talk more about this, Margot Thorning. She is the Senior Vice President and Chief Economist for the American Council on Capital Formation. And Fred Krupp, he is the President of the Environmental Defense Fund. Thanks both for joining us. Fred, let me ask you, first of all, nuclear power, environmental groups helped almost kill it. Back in the 1970s and early 80s. They called it evil. They demonstrated against it. Many of those same groups that were demonstrating against it are now supporting a return of nuclear power. If they hadn't tried to kill it 30 years ago, where might we be today in terms of energy self-sufficiency?
Well, John, I don't know that it's true that environmental groups were behind the lack of orders for nuclear power plants. I think the accidents in Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island gave rise to real fears that nuclear power could be risky. I think now that we have the problem of global warming to deal with, there is an open mind that, hey, this is a low-carbon source, but we still need assurances that it can be done safely and need assurances as to what should be done with the waste.
Margot Thorning, what do you think? If we had kept going with nuclear through the 80s and 90s, would we be a lot further ahead today in energy self-sufficiency than we are now?
Probably so, because nuclear power can, as many countries are investing, can provide very real increase in no carbon source of energy. And remember that the U.S. can't grow without energy. Each 1% of GDP takes 0.2% increase in energy use. So I think it's very good that the administration is pushing forward to try to get more nuclear plants on the books.
But what do you think? Is it just too expensive now? As former Vice President Gore was saying, costs have been going up 15% a year for 30 years.
I don't think that's quite accurate. I don't think it's any more. It's maybe slightly more expensive than coal and natural gas plants, but it's less expensive than renewable energy, because renewable energy wind and solar have to be backed up with conventional fossil or nuclear, because the sun only shines 12 hours a day and the wind doesn't always blow. So when you add in the need to back up renewable energy with conventional energy, I think nuclear stacks up pretty well.
Let's turn to Copenhagen, because Fred Krupp, you actually met with the president yesterday before he headed off to Oslo about all of this. Is the jury still out on whether there is a human component to global warming?
No, I think the real question, John, is are we going to join the world in getting into the new energy economy? I happen to think even if East Anglia University didn't exist, that there would still be our understanding of climate science would still be the same as it is now. But think about it. When the world turns to a clean energy economy, and when the U.S. passes a declining cap on carbon emissions, we'll get more nuclear power if that turns out to be cheap. And if it doesn't, if it's a market-based program, we'll get solar and wind. What else will we get? We'll get cleaner air. We will get less dependence on Mideast oil. We will get innovation in our economy and more jobs. And that's if the worst predictions about climate change are wrong. But if those predictions are right, we'll also be solving one of the biggest challenges to humanity.
Margot Thorning, do you have any argument with that?
Well, I think Fred overlooks the fact that China and India have only agreed to slow their growth of emissions. They haven't agreed to reduce emissions, and they're not likely to do so. So even if the U.S. passed a Waxman-Markey or Kerry-Boxer bill and achieved the targets, by the end of the end of this century, there will be virtually no reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions. So what we need is a global solution, not one that places very sharp near-term emission reduction targets on the U.S. It simply will hurt U.S. job growth. We did a study with the National Energy Modeling System that showed that U.S. loses jobs overall, even though you count on picking up new green jobs. We lose jobs overall under the Waxman-Markey bill, and we slow GDP growth. That's not the kind of solution to climate change we ought to be looking at.
And what kind of effect, Margaret, do you think that the Copenhagen conference will have on that calculation?
I think it could actually end up hurting U.S. households if we come back with a political agreement from Copenhagen to reduce U.S. emissions, say 17% off 2005 levels by 2020. We will certainly slow investment, slow job growth. We will divert companies to making end-of-tailpipe solutions to try to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. It won't encourage the kind of investment we're going to need for long-term weaning ourselves off fossil fuel.
Fred Krupp, what do you say to that?
I've read Margot's study, and I understand those are the conclusions she's reached. But the independent people that have looked at this, the Congressional Budget Office, MIT, EPA, all of those independent analysts have found that there's really no effect. The economy will grow at about 3% per year, the same as it has since World War II. So the real question is, are we going to let China and India move ahead in this race for the clean energy economy, or are we going to jump into the game? The real question is, do we want to be buying these technologies from overseas, or do we want to be selling them and benefiting from having all these jobs created at home? I don't know why, John, Margot is so pessimistic. We're the country that put a man on the moon and brought him back safely. We invented the computers and the internet. Surely, Margot, we can do this. We've got the talent and the ingenuity to deliver a clean energy economy and the products that the world wants at reasonable prices.
What do you say to that argument that if the United States doesn't do it, and I heard Tom Friedman talking about that earlier today with Wolf Blitzer on the Situation Room, China is all set, willing, and excited about kicking our butt in this particular area?
Well, China is going to be tough to compete against for things like wind power. They're already supplying most of the new wind fields in West Texas. So I think we need to focus on what's good for the U.S. Substituting more expensive energy, which renewable energy is, for cheaper energy is not going to help us get out of this economic slump or increase job growth. So I think we need to focus on new technology. We need energy conservation. We need renewables. But by imposing mandatory near-term targets, we are inevitably going to slow growth. Fred is wrong about CBO. CBO testified on October 16th that the Waxman-Markey bill, one of the major bills being looked at, will slow growth between 0.5 and over 1% a year. A host of other studies show the same thing.
Here's a question I have. So much energy, Fred, is spent fighting these issues. If people were to come together, meet halfway at the very least, could we get a lot more done than we're getting done now?
You know, John, that's a great point, and that's why in the last few weeks I've been so encouraged. In fact, today, Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, Senator Joe Lieberman, the independent from Connecticut, and John Kerry jointly put out a blueprint that calls for more drilling off our coasts, more nuclear power to help with energy independence, and this declining cap on carbon that will be the catalyst to create more American jobs. A lot of these jobs can't be outsourced. You know, on solar panels, just yesterday, NRG commissioned a whole new, the largest field of solar panels ever in this country, all those panels made here in the USA.
Margot, is there a middle ground? Can the two sides meet somewhere and begin to walk forward?
I would think so, but I think instead of looking at a cap-and-trade system, which has been widely discussed in Congress, there are people interested in imposing a tax on carbon emissions instead of a cap-and-trade system. If we were to adopt a mandatory carbon emission reduction program, most economists think a simple tax that ratcheted up slowly would send the kind of signals that households and producers need. So I think the Lindsey Graham plan, which came out today, the Kerry Graham-Lieberman plan, requires a 17% reduction off 2005 levels by 2020. It's virtually the same thing. The positive thing about their initiative is it does focus on U.S. oil and gas development, nuclear power, and trying to help U.S. manufacturing.
All right. Margot Thorning, Fred Krupp, good to see you. Thanks for stopping by tonight.
Thank you, John.
And of course, we'll keep watching all the developments at the Copenhagen Summit. Until next week.